The evening was busy at the upscale restaurant. The air was filled with the pleasant hum of conversations and the soft clinking of glassware. The guests at the tables were dressed in fine clothing, enjoying their meals, and the waitstaff moved gracefully between tables, doing their best to meet the needs of the customers. Among the staff was a young woman, a waitress who had been working here for several months. She had learned to navigate the busy environment with ease, but she always kept her head down, quietly doing her job without drawing attention to herself. Her name didn't really matter in a place like this. She wasn't one of the high-rolling patrons who came in for a lavish meal or to show off their wealth. She was just a waitress, a person working behind the scenes to make sure everyone else had a good experience. She was used to being overlooked. She was good at what she did, taking orders, serving food, clearing tables, but that was where her job ended. No one ever really paid attention to the people serving the food, not unless something went wrong. The restaurant was known for its luxurious atmosphere, the kind of place where the rich and powerful came to dine, and where everything was expected to be perfect. The staff was trained to maintain a certain standard, from the way they dressed to the way they spoke to the guests. And that was exactly how this waitress had learned to conduct herself, polite, respectful, and always professional, even if it meant swallowing her pride. She had no grand ambitions of becoming a famous chef or a renowned artist. She didn't expect anything more from life than to survive and get by. But she had a secret, one that she kept to herself. Beneath her quiet exterior, there was a talent that no one knew about. She was an incredible pianist. It was a passion she had carried with her since childhood, something that had given her comfort during tough times. But she never let anyone in on it. Music had always felt like a distant dream, something that had no place in her current reality. She had once imagined a life filled with music, where she could play for an audience, where people would be amazed by her skill and talent. But life had a way of taking those dreams and pushing them aside. Reality had set in, and playing music professionally seemed too far out of reach. Her family had always struggled financially, and dreams of becoming a concert pianist had seemed as unrealistic as dreaming of becoming a movie star. So she played only in private, on an old piano at home that had seen better days, keeping her talent hidden from the world. That evening, the restaurant was especially busy, with every table filled and every staff member working hard to make sure the customers had a great experience. As she moved from table to table, taking orders, delivering food, and making small talk with the guests, she tried to remain invisible, focusing on the tasks at hand. But then something changed. A man entered the restaurant and he immediately drew attention. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his hair neatly combed back, and his demeanor screamed wealth and confidence. He carried himself with a sense of superiority, as though the world owed him something. He walked into the restaurant as though he were the king of the world, casting a glance at the waitstaff as though he was inspecting them. When the hostess showed him to his table, he didn't say a word. He simply sat down, exuding an air of entitlement. The waitress knew the type. She had seen men like him before, arrogant, self-assured, and used to being in control. He was the kind of customer who expected everyone around him to cater to his every whim. And that was exactly what he expected from her as well. She approached his table, ready to take his order, her face calm and neutral. But the moment she spoke, he barely looked up at her. Instead, he waved his hand dismissively as if she were nothing more than an annoyance to him. He glanced at the menu, scanning the items with little interest, as if the choice of food wasn't something he had to think about. His eyes met hers, and in that moment he gave her a slight smirk. "I'll have the lobster," he said, his voice cold and condescending, "and make sure it's cooked just right. I wouldn't want any mistakes." "You wouldn't want to ruin a fine meal, would you?" The word stung, but the waitress didn't let it show. She had learned a long time ago how to smile through the insults, how to keep her head down and just do her job. But inside, a small part of her bristled. It wasn't just the way he spoke to her. It was the way he treated her, as though she were less than him, as though she didn't matter at all. It was a feeling she had grown used to, but it never made it easier. She nodded politely. "Of course, sir. I'll take care of that for you." Her voice was calm, controlled. She turned to walk away, but as she did, she could feel his eyes on her, and the sting of his judgment lingered. She didn't let it affect her. She couldn't afford to. But deep down, she couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice. What made him think he was better than her? Was it his expensive suit? His flashy watch? or the way he carried himself as though he were born to be treated like royalty. She had worked just as hard as he had, perhaps harder, and yet here she was in a position where she had to accept being belittled by someone like him. She went to the kitchen, her mind still racing. The chef was busy preparing the lobster and she handed over the order, trying to push away the uncomfortable thoughts. She would do her job just like she always did. It was the only way to survive in a place like this. She would never let anyone see how much the insults got to her, even if they stung more than she wanted to admit. But as she carried the meal back to his table, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was just a small piece in a very big machine. A machine where people like him were in charge, and people like her were there to serve. As she placed the lobster down in front of him, he didn't even thank her. He barely even acknowledged her presence, and she was starting to feel the weight of it. She had worked in places like this before. She had served people who treated her with respect and others who treated her as if she were invisible, but it was moments like this that made her question her place in the world. Was this really all there was for her? Was this the best she could hope for? She returned to her station, trying to push away the negative thoughts. She kept her head down, focusing on the tasks in front of her. She couldn't afford to get lost in daydreams or wonder about what could have been. She needed to get through the night, do her job, and then go home. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. Little did she know this night would be different. Something was about to happen that would change everything. She just had no idea that it would come from the last person she would ever expect. The night continued with the restaurant bustling with the usual energy. The clinking of silverware and soft chatter of the guests filled the air, and the waitstaff, including the waitress, moved smoothly between tables, always with a smile, always professional. The young woman had learned to perfect the art of balancing politeness with distance, never letting her true feelings show, even if her heart wasn't fully in it. She worked hard just like the rest of them, but it felt like she was invisible in this world of high-end restaurants and wealthy customers. As she made her rounds, she noticed the man again. He was still sitting at his table, flipping through a business magazine with an air of superiority. Every now and then, he would glance at the waitstaff as if checking to see if they were performing their duties well. There was no warmth in his gaze, just cold, judgmental eyes that seemed to measure the worth of everyone around him. It was as though he could only see people as either useful to him or beneath him. The waitress tried her best to ignore him, but there was something about the way he carried himself that kept drawing her attention. She had always been the kind of person who could easily blend into the background, who avoided confrontation, but something about him rubbed her the wrong way. It wasn't just his arrogance. It was the way he assumed that everyone around him existed to serve him, as though his wealth and status made him better than the people working around him. But the truth was, she knew this feeling all too well. She had spent most of her life in the shadows, serving others, and at times it felt like she was just a piece of the background. She wasn't important enough to stand out, and the world seemed to have forgotten about people like her. It wasn't that she hated her job. She liked being able to earn a living, and there was something about the restaurant's calm and quiet atmosphere that brought her a sense of peace. But on nights like tonight, when she had to serve people who seemed to treat her like she was invisible, it became difficult to ignore the feelings of inadequacy that crept in. She tried to shake off the thoughts, telling herself that it wasn't worth dwelling on. The man wasn't her concern. Her job was to serve food, take orders, and keep everything running smoothly. But the nagging sense that she wasn't respected, that she wasn't seen for who she truly was, lingered in the back of her mind. As the night went on, the waitress found herself thinking more and more about her past, her love for music, for the piano, the way the sound of the keys had always felt like a balm to her soul, healing wounds that no one else could see. She had learned to play when she was young, sitting at the old piano in her home practicing with determination. But as the years passed, she learned that music wasn't something she could make a living from. It was just a dream, a part of herself she had to bury deep inside. She thought about the people who had once told her she would never amount to anything if she didn't pursue something practical. They told her that playing the piano wasn't going to pay the bills, that it was a waste of time. So she had stopped dreaming about it. She had stopped thinking of herself as a musician, and had started thinking of herself as a waitress, someone who worked in the shadows, making sure everyone else had what they needed. There was a sense of safety in that, even if it didn't make her truly happy. But tonight there was a feeling in the air that was different. Maybe it was the way the man treated her, or maybe it was the way he spoke down to her so casually. Something about his attitude stirred something deep inside her. She couldn't quite place it, but it wasn't just anger. It was a feeling of being tired. Tired of pretending that she didn't have more to offer than the role she had been given. She had more to give, but no one ever asked. No one ever noticed. The evening wore on, and the man continued to act as though he was the most important person in the room. He made small talk with his companions, only to turn back to his magazine when they didn't hold his attention. He didn't acknowledge the waitress unless he needed something, his coffee refilled, his water glass topped off. It was as though she was a part of the background, just another figure in his world of luxury. He didn't know her name, didn't care to learn it. To him, she was just a face among many. The waitress continued to do her job, but there was a quiet fire growing inside her. It wasn't a fire of rage, but of realization. She was tired of letting people like him dictate her worth. She was tired of living in the shadows, where her talents were hidden, where no one knew who she really was. What if she could show him, show all of them, that there was more to her than just the woman serving the plates of food? As the evening came to a close, the restaurant began to empty out. The rich man had finished his meal and sat back, looking bored. His dinner companions had left, and the waitress began to clear the table. She glanced at the piano in the corner of the room. It had been there all night, and no one had paid it any attention. The piano had been a part of the restaurant's decor, but it had gone largely ignored by the patrons. To most of the guests, it was just another piece of furniture in the room, but to her it was more than that. It had always been more. The piano was a link to her past, a reminder of who she used to be before life had forced her to become someone else. The sound of its keys had always made her feel alive. It had been her escape, her way to express everything that words couldn't say. In that moment, the idea came to her. What if she played? What if she stopped hiding? What if she showed everyone who she really was, including that arrogant man sitting in the corner? It was a bold thought, one she immediately pushed aside. She had no reason to do anything so drastic. She wasn't a performer, not anymore. And besides, who would care? It would be a silly thing to do. But the more she thought about it, the more the idea took root. The piano was sitting there, untouched. She had seen others perform before, and the applause had always been so warm and welcoming. Maybe, just maybe, she could do the same. Maybe it was time for her to stop being invisible, to stop letting people like him define her worth. With a quiet resolve, she made her way over to the piano. Her hands trembled slightly, but she pushed past the nerves. No one was paying attention to her now. The restaurant had quieted. The last of the guests had left, and the atmosphere had shifted. The moment was now or never. She sat down at the piano and hesitated for a second, taking a deep breath. The keys felt cool beneath her fingers, and for a moment, she let her mind wander back to all the hours she had spent playing as a child. Then, without another thought, she pressed her fingers down and began to play. The sound of the piano filled the room, a soft, gentle melody at first, but quickly growing in intensity. It was a song she knew well, one that she had played many times before. The music flowed from her like it always had, her fingers moving with practiced ease. The sound of the piano was like a weight being lifted from her shoulders. It was the first time in a long while that she had truly felt free. As the notes filled the room, she could feel something shifting within herself. And for the first time that night, she wasn't worried about the man or his judgment. She wasn't worried about anything at all. The music was all that mattered. As her fingers danced over the keys, the sound of the piano filled the restaurant, rich and resonant. It was almost as if the room had transformed. The bustling, noisy restaurant that had once been filled with the chatter of well-dressed guests now felt quieter. The atmosphere shifted, and the music seemed to echo through the empty space, bringing a sense of calm and serenity to the surroundings. At first, the waitress wasn't sure if anyone would even notice. She wasn't performing for anyone. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, least of all the wealthy man who had treated her with such casual disregard. She was simply playing because it felt right. It was as though all the years of suppressing her love for music, all the moments she had hidden away her talent, were being released in one long, uninterrupted melody. The music, soothing and beautiful, came from somewhere deep within her, a place she had long since forgotten. Her heart raced a little, but there was also a deep sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. There was no pretense, no acting to please others. She wasn't pretending to be someone she wasn't. She was just herself, raw, real, and lost in the beauty of the music. Unbeknownst to her, the man at the corner table had paused. His eyes, which had been focused on his phone, now wandered up toward the sound of the piano. His expression shifted, no longer one of casual disinterest, but one of curiosity. He hadn't expected to hear something like this in a restaurant. A place like this was for business deals and fine dining, not for live music, but there it was. A beautiful, unexpected melody that seemed to demand attention. He set his phone down slowly, his gaze shifting from the pianist's hands on the keys to her face. For a moment he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The music was unlike anything he had imagined. It was gentle yet powerful, like a hidden depth that he had never considered. He didn't know why, but something about the way the music moved him felt strange, unfamiliar, almost humbling. The waitress, completely unaware of his growing attention, continued to play. She was lost in her own world, her fingers moving fluidly over the keys, her mind free from the worries of her everyday life. The moment felt like an escape, a chance to breathe and express something that had been trapped inside her for far too long. She played with emotion, her heart speaking through each note, letting the music fill the empty space around her. The man leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on her. He had no idea who she was. All he knew was that this woman, this waitress, had an incredible gift. It was the last thing he had expected. He had come to the restaurant for a simple meal, nothing more. But now, sitting there in the dim light, listening to the music she created, he couldn't deny that there was something extraordinary about her. He found himself drawn to her in a way he hadn't expected. There was an undeniable power in her music, and it was making him realize something he had never considered before. As the song reached its climax, the room felt even quieter. The only sound was the music and the faint rustle of air as the waitress's fingers moved across the keys. There was a kind of magic in the air, a rare moment where everything felt aligned. It was as though she had transformed from a mere waitress, someone who served food and went unnoticed, into something far more important. She was a musician. She was a force, and the music was her way of showing it. The man, still mesmerized by the sound, finally broke his silence. Slowly he stood up, not wanting to disturb the performance, but needing to acknowledge what he had just witnessed. He walked toward the piano, his footsteps soft against the floor. He had seen countless performances before, elegant concerts, private recitals, even charity galas, but this felt different. This felt personal. The music had struck a chord with him that he didn't quite understand. He wasn't sure if he was more impressed by her playing or by the fact that she was a waitress, someone he had barely given a second thought to just an hour ago. As he approached her, the waitress's fingers slowed and she turned toward him, her heart beating a little faster now. She hadn't expected anyone to notice. In fact, she had hoped no one would, that she could finish her song in peace and return to her quiet life behind the scenes. But here he was, standing in front of her, his gaze intense, his eyes wide with something she couldn't quite place. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt heavy, but it was different from the usual awkward silences that came from uncomfortable situations. This silence was filled with understanding. He looked at her, then glanced down at the piano as if searching for the right words. "Who are you?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught her off guard. It wasn't the kind of question she was used to hearing. People didn't ask her who she was. They didn't care. She was just the waitress, nothing more. But now, with him standing there, his attention fully on her, it felt like a different world altogether. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. She wasn't used to being noticed in this way. "I'm just a waitress," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't sure if she should even answer him. She hadn't expected anyone to ask her for more than her name or her order, but the man shook his head almost as if he had not believed her. He stood a little straighter, his expression shifting to one of admiration and perhaps even regret. "No," he said, his tone firmer now. "You're not just a waitress. You're a pianist, and you're incredible." Why don't you do this for a living? The question stung a little. It wasn't because she didn't want to be a pianist. It was because she had already made peace with the fact that her dream of becoming a musician was a fantasy. It wasn't practical. It wasn't a real career. She had to work to survive, and playing piano didn't pay the bills. It was something she had buried deep inside herself, something she had abandoned years ago. I don't know if that's something I can do, she said softly, looking down at the piano keys. It's complicated. The man didn't say anything at first. He stood there watching her closely, his mind racing. He had always been someone who took what he wanted. He had everything: money, power, influence. But something about this woman made him feel like he had been missing something all along. The music, the way she played, had revealed something to him that he hadn't realized he was missing. She wasn't just another person in the crowd. She wasn't just the waitress who served him his meal. She was something more, and he wanted to know her story. The silence between them lingered, but this time it was not uncomfortable. It was the beginning of something new, a realization for both of them. The man had seen the waitress, truly seen her for the first time, and the waitress in that moment realized that maybe she wasn't just meant to stay in the background. Maybe she wasn't just meant to serve others. Maybe it was time for her to step into the light, to show the world who she really was. For a few moments, the only sound in the restaurant was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of the kitchen door swinging open. The silence felt almost heavy, like something important was about to happen, but neither of them knew exactly what. The waitress looked at the man still standing in front of her. She felt a mix of surprise and uncertainty. She had never expected this moment. She had never imagined that someone like him, someone who looked down on the people around him without even realizing it, would see her as more than just a waitress. She had spent so many years believing that people like him would never look twice at her, that her dreams didn't matter, that her passions didn't have a place in a world that valued only practicality and success. But now, here he was, standing so close, with something in his eyes she hadn't expected. It wasn't the cold indifference she was used to. It wasn't the casual dismissiveness that came with wealth or status. His gaze was softer, almost searching, as if he was trying to understand something about her he hadn't before. "You don't have to be just a waitress," he said again, his voice quieter this time. There was a new earnestness in his tone, and it caught her off guard. "I'm not trying to tell you how to live your life, but I know real talent when I see it. You could do something with your music. You deserve more than just this." The words hung in the air, and for a moment the waitress felt as if she might drown in them. No one had ever said anything like that to her before, not in such a genuine way, not with such belief. She wasn't sure how to respond. She had spent so long convincing herself that this was enough, that this life was the best she could get. She didn't know how to react when someone saw more in her than she saw in herself. She looked down at her hands resting on the keys, the music still lingering in the air. It was hard to deny that a part of her longed to leave this life behind, to be the person she had always dreamed of being. But another part of her, the part that had learned to survive, to get by, reminded her of how hard it was to break free from the life she knew. It wasn't as easy as just playing the piano. There were bills to pay, obligations to meet. Dreams didn't always fit into the world people had to live in. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never thought about it. I've never even allowed myself to think about it." The man studied her for a long moment, his expression soft but serious. "Maybe it's time you did. Maybe it's time you allowed yourself to see what you're capable of. You're not just here to serve food and clean tables. You have something special. And if you don't do something with that, it'll be wasted." His words were like a spark, tiny but bright enough to make her wonder if something inside her could finally catch fire. She had been so afraid of failure, so afraid of disappointment, so afraid of dreaming and falling short. She had been so focused on survival, on getting through each day, that she had forgotten how to dream, how to feel alive. But now, hearing him speak like this, she couldn't help but feel a stir of something deep inside her, a feeling she hadn't had in a long time. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was belief. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering, what if there was more to her life than serving others? What if the music she had buried deep inside her wasn't meant to stay hidden? The moment stretched on, and the man, sensing her hesitation, took a step back. He wasn't trying to push her, but he was trying to show her something, show her that she had a choice, that she didn't have to settle for being invisible. "You don't have to take my word for it," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But if you ever decide to take that leap, you don't have to do it alone. There are people who can help, and who knows, maybe you'll inspire someone else the way you've inspired me tonight." The words echoed in her mind long after he had walked away, his steps quiet on the polished floor as he returned to his table. The restaurant had mostly emptied by now, the lights dimming as the staff began to clean up. The hum of conversation had died down, leaving only the soft tapping of her fingers on the piano keys. The waitress remained seated staring at the piano, her heart racing. She had no idea what the future held. She didn't know if she could make this change, if she was brave enough to break free from the life she had known for so long. But something had shifted in her. Something inside her had cracked open, and for the first time in years she could feel the possibility of a different life. The music still lingered in the room, like a whisper that refused to be ignored. She thought about the man's words, about how he had seen her for who she really was. He hadn't judged her for her job, hadn't looked down on her for working in a restaurant. He had simply seen the musician inside her, the pianist who had been hidden away for so long. It was a feeling that was both humbling and empowering. She had spent so many years hiding her true self, convinced that no one would ever care. But this man, this stranger, had seen her, and for once it felt like she wasn't invisible. After a few moments of quiet contemplation, she stood up from the piano and walked over to the counter. The restaurant was almost empty now, and the staff was finishing up their tasks. The busboy was sweeping the floor, and the manager was wiping down the counters. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't need to. But as she walked to the back of the restaurant to collect her things, she felt a sense of calm that she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of peace that came from the music, from the quiet courage that was beginning to grow inside her. When she reached the back door to leave for the night, she paused for a moment. There in the darkened restaurant, the echoes of the piano still rang in her ears. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything she had just experienced. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to be invisible anymore. She wasn't just a waitress, and she wasn't just a dreamer either. She was a musician, and that was something she would never forget again. The next few days were a blur. The waitress couldn't stop thinking about the man's words. They seemed to follow her, lingering in the back of her mind like a whisper that wouldn't go away. She had never considered the possibility of a life outside of her job, a life where she could truly embrace her passion for music. But now it felt like something inside her had shifted. Something that had been dormant for years was beginning to awaken. At first, she tried to push the thought away. She told herself that she was being foolish. Music wasn't a career. It wasn't something that paid the bills. She had responsibilities. She had rent to pay, groceries to buy, and a future to secure. There was no room for dreams, no room for unrealistic aspirations. She had lived like that for so long, convincing herself that this was all she was meant to be, that the life she had was the best she could ever get. But every time she sat down at the piano to play, the music filled her with a sense of joy and peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She couldn't deny that playing the piano was more than just a hobby to her. It was part of who she was. It was something that made her feel alive, something that gave her a sense of purpose beyond the walls of the restaurant. One afternoon, while she was wiping down a table in the restaurant, the manager approached her. She was surprised when he spoke, as he usually didn't take much interest in her or her work. He was a busy man, always focused on the bottom line, making sure everything ran smoothly. But today he looked at her with a different expression. There was something in his eyes, something that made her feel uneasy. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, motioning for her to step aside. She followed him to the back of the restaurant, her heart pounding. What could he possibly want to talk about? She hadn't done anything wrong, had she? "I've been thinking," the manager began, pacing back and forth in the small kitchen area. The restaurant could use some live music. It could really bring in more customers, you know. I was wondering if you'd be willing to play during dinner hours, just a few songs every night. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but I think it could really set us apart from the other places around here. The waitress's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had never once imagined that her job as a waitress would lead to anything like this. The manager was asking her to play live music at the restaurant, to share her passion with the customers. It was an opportunity she had never thought possible. But was she ready for it? Was she brave enough to step into the spotlight, even if it was just for a few songs at a time? I don't know, she said, her voice uncertain. I'm not sure if I'm ready for something like that. I'm just a waitress. I don't know if I have what it takes to play in front of people. What if I mess up? The manager gave her a reassuring smile, his tone softening. You don't have to be perfect. People just want to hear something beautiful. And I've seen you play. You've got something special. It's a chance for you to show the world what you can do. It might even be a step toward something bigger. Who knows? The words felt like a challenge, but they also felt like an invitation. He wasn't pressuring her. He was offering her a chance to take a risk, to step outside her comfort zone. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the urge to say yes, to take the leap. I'll think about it, she said, her voice quiet but determined. It wasn't a yes yet, but it wasn't a no either. She needed time to process everything, to figure out what she really wanted. The next few days were filled with uncertainty. The waitress spent her time debating the decision. Should she play in front of the customers? Should she take the risk? She didn't know what was scarier, the thought of performing in front of strangers or the thought of living a life where she never pursued her dreams. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the fear of failure was nothing compared to the regret of never trying. Finally, she made a decision. She would do it. She would play. It wasn't going to be easy. She knew there would be moments of doubt, moments where she would question whether she was good enough. But the truth was, she had been hiding behind her own fears for far too long. She had let her self-doubt hold her back, and she wasn't going to do that anymore. The following week, when the restaurant began to fill up with customers, she sat down at the piano once again. Her fingers brushed the keys, the familiar sensation of the piano under her hands filling her with a sense of calm. The moment she started playing, she realized that the fear wasn't as bad as she thought. The music took over. It was no longer about the crowd, no longer about how she looked or how she sounded. It was about the music. It was about sharing a part of herself that had been hidden for so long. As the notes of the first song filled the restaurant, she looked up and saw the faces of the customers. They were listening. Some were even smiling, swaying to the rhythm of the music. It was a simple tune, nothing too complicated, but it was hers. It came from her heart, and that made all the difference. The applause that followed was soft at first, hesitant, but it grew louder as she finished the song. The waitress smiled, a shy but genuine smile. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so alive. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a woman serving food to others. She was a musician, sharing her soul with the world, and it felt incredible. From that day on, the restaurant became a little more than just a place for food. It became a place where people could experience something special. The waitress continued to play every evening, slowly gaining confidence with each song. And as her music filled the room, she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just performing for the customers. She was performing for herself. Her dreams were no longer hidden in the shadows. They were real, and they were hers to embrace. And she knew deep down that this was only the beginning.